You have returned to hear more stories of Greenwold's past. I do often think it best when facing the horrors of the present to look back. And what a varied past Greenwold has. From the brutal murder and dismemberment that we looked at last time to the theatre troupe murders of the 1960s, I believe it was. But I think for today's tale, we'll just go back 1 year prior to our previous tale, to 1952. I believe that young Glenda Pink may be the key to yet another of Greenwold's horrors. Are you ready for the disastrous consequences of the Devil's Doorway? Everything I am about to tell you is compiled from the information that we had at our disposal to the best of our ability. There may be a few artistic liberties that have been taken, but for the most part, we can rely on the fact that it is at least mostly based on fact. Deep in the woods that line the east side of Greenwold, and the green from which the village gets its name, lived the old carpenter. Nobody could be quite sure of his name, because having lived in the seclusion of the trees for the past 4 decades, on the rare occasion that he was referred to at all, he simply went by one of a number of nicknames, a fair few of them rather unsavoury, I'm afraid. You see, for example, Miss Rose, who ran the corner shop, simply knew him as the Old Grouch. Librarians called him the Wood Troll, and Mr. Oaker the publican knew him only as Steel Thighs, for reasons which have almost definitely been lost to the abyss of time. To Police Officer Plum, he was known as Woody Woodward, which is what Plum wrote down on his death report upon examining the poor man's body. Plum thought to himself,
"I'm sure I'll be able to update it as soon as I find it out."
But unfortunately he never did. And so the poor man's name on all official records will forever be Woody Woodward. Mr. Woodward's body was found in the woodland, holding his favourite axe behind the stump of a tree he had presumably just felled. Upon examination of the body, Dr. Periwinkle concluded that it must simply have been a heart attack, and mourned the loss of locally produced affordable furniture. If Plum and Periwinkle had had their way, Woody Woodward would have been buried and forgotten. And he might well have been, if it weren't for the village witches. Witches was a self-identification. Really, they were a group of 3 roommates who just wanted to be left to themselves, so spread tales of curses and hexes they cast on villagers who got in their way, wore floaty dresses, and occasionally disappeared off into the woods for a few days. You know, normal kinds of witchy things. Keeping up the pretense turned out to be a lot of hard work, and Miriam, the youngest of the 3, even had to pour bleach on Mrs. Umber's prize-winning dahlias to make it seem like one of their curses had been successful. But the main commitment of pretending to be a fully fledged spell-casting witch is in research. So they read up extensively on local folklore and superstitions, and most of those superstitions were, well, unprovable for the most part. Not that I would suggest that fables and folklore are fiction, but most can be put down to the kind of educational stories that most fables become. You know, the kind, don't walk mud through the house, otherwise the swamp creature will follow the mud trails and eat your eyes out of your skull as you sleep, or similar. But sometimes, on occasion, there is a folk tale or fable that is just too bizarre and out of pocket to learn any kind of lesson from. And oftentimes historians, themselves only storytellers based on the flawed understandings of their own nuggets of knowledge, put these stories down to lessons that just no longer apply to the world as we know it. And that's why we can't understand them. Suggesting that the story is to stop people putting their bobbins upside down on the loom, or to encourage people not to bring extinct poisonous snakes into their house or the sort. I'm sure they're sometimes correct. I can only piece together the information as I find it from the archives, but sometimes a story is just that, a story. And sometimes even the most unlikely stories turn out to be the truth. When researching the stories of magic and folklore, the Greenwold witches happened across the tale of the Devil's Doorway, a story that some of the elders of the village were already aware, having been told when they were just young. And it's a story that fitted the witches' purposes perfectly, which would mean they could refrain from any further flower-bed fiascos. The story was as follows. Many centuries ago, the village folk of Greenwold lived in prosperous land. The remains of the ancient river still flowed lightly from the valley, not quite as roaring as it had millennia before, but it still meant that the land was green and fertile. Their crops grew tall and nutritious, and their livestock's meat and milk were rich and delicious. The people of Greenwold were the envy of all the surrounding towns. But instead of being selfish and growing covetous, they were generous and kind, and spread the good fortunes of their plentiful produce. But in fertile grounds, the roots spread deep, and there were very few lands as fertile as Greenwold, so the roots grew very, very deep. So deep, in fact, that one stray root just kept burrowing and burrowing and burrowing down and down and down until it broke through into a deep, deep cavern. A cavern that had remained untouched since. And as the root broke through the cavern's roof, a small clump of dislodged dirt dropped onto the face of the cavern's inhabitant, waking him up for the first time in millennia. "Who dares wake me from my slumber?" He grabbed the root that had interrupted his hibernation and shot up it in a flash of flames. The tree that the root belonged to stood no chance, and was little more than a smoking pile of charcoal as the inhabitants stepped over the threshold and towards the village. Over the next few days, the inhabitants stopped the ancient river flowing, destroyed the town's crops, and brought disease and pestilence. And amongst the village folk, this inhabitant became known as the Devil. Now, whether he was indeed the devil or just an unnamed malevolent creature who was buried deep in the earth is a matter of semantics more than an actual useful distinction. Because all the villagers knew was that he needed to go. The devil enjoyed tricks and riddles. Before burning a farmer's crops, he would often go to the farmer and present him with an impossible task or an unanswerable question with the facade of mercy. And then, as the farmer scrambled to try and complete said task, the devil would tell stories of how he was woken from his slumber and travelled up the roots of a tree to find his way here. And then, when the farmer obviously failed his impossible task, the devil would delight in the torment of watching the farmer's pain as his livelihood was destroyed. So one day, a young girl decided to beat the devil at his own game. And she said, "You there,
Before you fill my house with disease and pain, destroy my parents' hives of bees, and kill me, as you surely will, I challenge you. Complete 3 of my challenges, and you can do all of the above and more.
You dare challenge me? I, who can conjure plagues of beetles with a click of my fingers. I, who have stopped the flow of a powerful ancient river. You think you can beat me?
But the devil didn't turn down a challenge, particularly not one he was sure he could win.
Go ahead. What is your wish?
My first challenge to you is a tough one. You see, 2 nights ago, I spilled beetroot juice down my favourite dress, and I can't get it out. Can you give it a go?
You want to use the devil as your personal laundrette?
Not knowing yet what a laundrette was, as one wouldn't exist for many centuries, the little girl simply nodded.
Bring me the dress.
So she did. And with a click of his fingers, the dried beetroot just seemed to burn off into the air, leaving behind a perfectly clean dress.
Silly girl,
the devil thought.
1 down.
Indeed, but the next one will be much harder. You see, over the last few days you've gone all over the valley. Bet you can't find where you came from, the tree you tell everyone about.
Is that it?
Well, I just don't believe you can do it.
Angered by her words, the devil clicked his fingers, and the girl and the devil suddenly both transported across the space, standing by the somehow still smouldering remains of the tree the devil had arrived by.
Here, easy. You'll have to try harder than that if you want to get the better of me.
Okay, well, one more. And this one is so hard I have no doubt you'll fail. In fact, I know it.
I won't.
You will.
I definitely won't.
You definitely will.
No, I won't.
You actually will. You see, I bet you can't go back down there, back along the roots that brought you here, back to your cavern in the ground. I just don't think you're powerful enough.
I am.
Then prove it.
And, without another word, the devil shoots back down the charred route, back to the cavern in the ground.
See, I told you I could.
But the girl wasn't listening, because hiding behind the nearby trees had been the rest of her family, and a few of the other village folk, holding pans of honey and tar and clay, and together they poured the mixture down the root hole that was left, all the way down to the cavern in the ground, and sealed it up. And later they grew a tree on top to lock the devil in place. They knew the tree roots would never reach as deep, because with the destruction of the ancient river, the village's time of prosperity was over. Now, the 3 witches, back in 1952, if you can remember that far back in the story, really latched on to this tale. They would tell people that their trips into the woodland were to ensure that the power of the devil's doorway, for that is what the tree that grew on top of the passage to the cavern became known as, stayed as strong as the day the honey and tar and clay was first poured into it. Gave them a pretty good cover for their dalliances. And then, when the carpenter, Woody Woodward, died, they said he had chopped down the doorway, and that is what killed him. So they'd have to spend even more time correcting the evil energies. But as the saying goes, even a fake witch is right from time to time. For Woody Woodward, the carpenter, did chop down the devil's doorway, and the power of evil emanating from below is what killed him. But the stump itself was the cork that kept the beast below, and away from the villagers of Greenwold. At least that was, till Glenda Pink came along. Hearing the witch's story, Glenda Pink, who was a curious child, ventured into the woodland and began talking to the stumps, whispering to the remnants of the woodcutter's doings. When she got to the stump that had killed Mr. Woodward, she claimed, years later, on her deathbed, that she had a vision of a huge creature covered in honey and tar who presented her with an ultimatum. She claims that her choice kept the devil deep underground, so whatever her choice was, her answer to this ultimatum, it was at least successful in keeping the devil at bay. She would never admit what her choice was on that fateful day, but looking at the newspapers of the time, it is possible that the 6 villagers who died in the week following, one each day, may have had something to do with Miss Pink's bargain. Whatever it was more shameful to her than the incident with the heart in the butcher's, for the truth of that day died with her. And so with that, I bid you a good night. Sleep well.